Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ahead of the Curve, this time in conjunction with Framework. You might have noticed that the format that you're viewing has changed a little bit. We now have a new, interesting, fun little logo up here with Framework. So welcome, everyone, to the show. I'd like to introduce our guest, Sundar Raman. Sundar, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure having you as well. So Sundar, would you mind giving us a little kind of insight as to where you are from, where you are now? I realize that it's actually quite a bit later on in the day in your part of the world, and a little bit of insight onto how you got into the industry and what you actually do within the industry.
Sure. I am currently in Dubai, and I'm associated with the Museum of the Future. But I got into this whole museum world somewhat by accident, actually, as with most things in life. You know, as an engineer, you end up like falling into things, and then you're like, okay, how do I dig myself out of this hole?
Or dig yourself more into that hole.
Or dig yourself further in, yes. But we kind of don't talk about that part right now, right? It used to be very cool to talk about our failures like about 2 years ago. Now we're like on the upward swing. I got into it primarily from being very interested in different parts of engineering as it applied to all kinds of stuff. So, you know, when you think about engineering from a historical perspective, it's more people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and people like that who actually made stuff happen, right? And those are a lot of inspirations. At one point, I wanted to be a veterinarian because I thought, like, you can engineer creatures and animals and things like that.
These days, especially.
Yeah, actually. It's getting close to where we can just do a touch designer version of a giraffe, you know, like as soon as we can like put these blocks together in a visual node-based programming environment, we're there. But over time, it's been a bunch of different things, everything from getting involved with solar power to community media to all kinds of things. Then you realize this creative experience field is really the culmination of all of these different skill sets coming together, trying to solve the problem of how people interact with their spaces. So I guess that's kind of a circuitous answer to just say, I started off thinking I was going on a straight path and then went down in a lot of detours and finally got to museums, which have a lot of really fun engagement opportunities.
It seems to be a very common path, to be honest, with a lot of people within our industry. You find yourself working in one disciplinary area or field, and then all of a sudden you basically take a hard right or a hard left turn, and you end up into a place that you never even imagined you would end up being in.
Very much. And I don't even know if it's a hard left or right. There you go. Okay, I know the line at one end, but then you realize though you're actually at the wrong end of the buffet line, and then like there's a large party in front of you, and you have to, and then you go, okay, I'm actually pretty happy over here, and then you need to keep moving, and that's what it feels like. It's not even detours. It's all still on the same track, but you didn't see all the other stuff that was around you, and you're like, oh, I need to go pay some more attention to this one thing.
Yeah, you seem to, it's kind of like an interweaving path, if you will, I guess,
yeah.
of different challenges that you may end up encountering, or puzzles, as you will, as you kind of encounter them. I just wanted to say hi to Christy. Hey, Christy, welcome back to the show. So Sundar, as far as like getting into the position that you are now, I think it's interesting to kind of touch a little bit on the background, because you're working in a space that requires a lot of focus on keeping people engaged, you know, and providing some very interesting content to these people. And we've been seeing a lot of trends, of course, and interactive designs, different ways to engage with people through the use of creative technology. How have you been seeing that kind of changing, and how has that been how is that coming into relation into your profession, your job, and the way that you're currently working?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think like when we think back to what experiences are, and I don't think this is anything new, right? Like we've been doing this sort of thing for a very long time. Like every space that wanted to engage people tried to do so in sort of interesting ways. And when you go back, even I would say museums have existed in the way that we know about them for maybe 300 years or so. And within that,
they've been around for a little while.
they've been around for significantly longer. But when you think about, oh, like a collection that we're going to tell the specific kind of story. I would say maybe 1700s or so. Maybe actually that may not be terribly accurate, but like prior to that, it was like collections that somebody had. Like when you go through that breadth of how these artifacts were presented to people, the interesting stuff happens when you're trying to convey the visitor or the guest into an entirely different frame of reference. So one of the weirdest and coolest points of inspirations for me was the Panopticon, which is the thing from, I forget the date actually when they started, but it was well into early in the 1800s, that the idea of going into a space that was a 360 essentially fabricated environment of somewhere completely foreign to the person who entered the space. So you come in through a porthole, walk around the space, and you're basically in like the Arctic or something like that. And it's the equivalent of what we would call VR today, except instead of putting on a headset, you're actually walking through a space.
Actually fully immersed in the environment.
Exactly, and that was like the first time that I was like, oh, these are immersive experiences. Like this is what this thing is. A friend of mine, when I started into the museum world, was when I started at Local Projects. This is about 2011 or thereabouts. And the person who hired me said that they were at the cutting edge of museum technology, which for me seemed like such an oxymoron, because like everyone thinks of museums as like not very cool at all, right? Like as a very stodgy kind of environment. But you realize that in order to tell stories of cultural artifacts in a meaningful way, you have to make the technology almost go away, which is what things like the Panopticon did. They could transport you to a new place where the story actually started making a lot more sense to you personally. It really became about what is my story within this context. And I think that's the part that even though we evolve technologically and whatever else, the thing is really about how do you tell the story for the person next to you, and then the person that you're going to convey the story to later. And then subsequently, like you're leaving your imprint in this space, but you're also learning from others in this space, Like I think the most successful experience
Seems like we might be having a little bit of
within this.
Sundar, would you mind just repeating that for a minute? We had a little bit of a glitch.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so right. I think the best examples of where immersive experiences really work are where the narrative is told to you, but you also have a mechanism to leave your version or your imprint onto these environments. I think we all try to grapple with that, like individual that help you to facilitate through the process, right? Like things like you have some kind of a widget or something that you can collect with, or something that you can draw with, or something to leave your guest imprint with. So anyway, sorry, going in on a bit of a tangent there, but it's always things where technology is more personalized and interfaces with the things that are around you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you anymore. I actually loved Laura's comment there, saying she loves contemplating museum technology from the 1800s. I assume they thought they were cutting edge as well.
Funnily, I think a lot of them were way more cutting edge than we give them credit for. Like we love to push the envelope of how much we can put onto a screen. But when you think about even crafted experiences that come together really well. And I'm trying to think about some good examples, even of like carpentry or metalwork or things that kind of move in certain ways. It's just really satisfying to play with those things. And unfortunately, I think we've kind of moved away from that. Like a lot of museums playing with these artifacts because they're afraid that they have only the one imprint of it. And like really the fun part is to be able to understand how these things work. And that's really the story, right? Like the immersiveness is in your being able to play in the space.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually just cutting on to like talking about the cutting edge side, because a lot of the cutting edge technologies usually come out of a story and a reason for them to be created and for them to evolve, right? So the whole idea of like bringing people into this 360-degree space to experience something at that time may have never been done before. That was cutting edge. This was a new creation of making an experience, which at that time, of course, and I think is also one of the main reasons that pushes us forward in the way that we create new technologies and new experiences is by the creation of these stories that are wanting to be portrayed in different ways to be able to convey these messages, to people that are coming to experience them. So
sure.
It's an interesting concept when you really think about it, because a lot of people, I find, look at things the opposite way. They'll look at it from a technology perspective. Yeah. And how can we push this technology to be used in different ways, when usually in a lot of cases it's the most simplistic solution and the simplistic ideology to be able to have technology work for that application, as opposed to making technology to work for an application that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, I think the mechanism there is, or the idea there is that some of the best technologies are backgrounded, like we want to keep making technology better to tell our stories, but in a way the technology is a facilitator, it's not the end result, right? Like you have to like think about technology as the means to tell your story, not as the destination to get to. And I think that's the hard part. Like some of these technologies have stood the test of time, and we have to be able to leverage them in certain ways, and we have to keep improving them. And you were talking about, even the 360. In a way, like how do you tell the story of having visited the Arctic Circle or the Sahara Desert to somebody who has never gone past their neighborhood? I mean, you don't have to transport them to every single part. And then on top of that, like you can't keep like adding layers of technology to it, because then they forget that the story is in the narrative. It's not in the technology that's around them. So and I think simplifying that implementation is also really hard. So sorry, there was a question that just popped up and I now missed it.
It was from Kella Cologne, asking, what do you think the future would look like inside of the Museum of the Future? Or what do you think the future looks like in general for museums? Might be a better way to pitch that question.
I would say, like, I would take it even broader and just say, what's the purpose of museums in many ways, right? I think one of the really interesting things that came out in the last year was, what is the relevance of museums when a lot of them were closed? Significant parts of the museum collection ecosystem had to get brought online, which was very difficult for institutions to do, because like they really relied on people to come into the space, right, for the longest time. I would say the future definitely looks very bright. And I would say the future also looks the way we want to tell our stories. We've also started seeing something where, we are personalizing the stories almost immediately. Like, if you think about all of the narratives of the last 24 months, really, of the US, if nowhere else in the world, the US has gone through so much incredible, like, introspection and narrative, in like that it will take us a very long time to even understand how to tell a lot of those stories and to like craft them from perspectives, right? I mean, in some ways, like, we're only able to tell some of the stories of certain communities in the US 50 years later, because now is the first time that we can really even understand what they went through. But we're telling the story of, like, let's say Black Lives Matter within weeks, or any of these events that we have to kind of compress into what is the experience that people had around it. I like to think about the future in a way that you actually have to go back to the past. So I use this analogy, like, anytime you want to know where you're going in the future, think back to if everything that you know today, you stepped back 50 years and somebody asked you at that point, what does the future look like? And you start by explaining what the technology looks like. It can be like, oh yeah, we have automatic cars, we have cell phones, we have video chat. But fundamentally, what we have is the ability to interact with each other and participate with each other in a way that we never had before, right? And in each generation, that has been the future. The future was our ability to be able to interact with somebody that was completely different from them, and build our societies from that. So things like our barriers between groups, for however you want to classify those groups, start falling away. We have more understanding, we have more empathy, we have more awareness, we have more excitement about the new things that we're learning. And I think that's where the narrative really starts looking bright.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you anymore. It's interesting that you actually use that analogy between looking ahead. You can learn a lot from looking into your past. And I think a lot of these things actually all revolve around communication and us being able to communicate in different ways with one another. I think a lot of that is, again, kind of going back to the ancient art of storytelling that we've already mentioned in this conversation, and that's being done in so many different ways and so many different expressive ways. And the pandemic really turned a lot of that on its head, because I think we got so used to working as a community and communicating in just like these certain routine ways that it all got broken. Like, it kind of almost got shattered in a lot of different ways once the pandemic came in. And it's never, of course, nothing like that's ever happened, especially in our age of technology, where people were scrambling to try and figure out, okay, well, how can we communicate now? Like, how can we convey these messages still and still have the ability to tell these stories?
Yeah,
and it's
actually an interesting thing that's happened is that we're at like, the pandemic could not have happened at a better time. Weirdly, I know that's a terrible statement to make, but
you hear that, pandemic? Your timing was perfect.
Thank you for your timing. Very good. If you think about all the tools that basically came into conjunction right around the beginning of last year, and it's not just the tools, that there was so much groundwork laid for us to even build the next generation of tools. I mean, I'm thinking everything from, we're both very much in the same world of, like, all the media tech, right? Mm-hmm. You think about media players, like there's a certain amount of consolidation that's been happening between media player devices and the show control software and mechanisms around that. This is something that's been needed for a long time. You take that to the next level of the simplification of the tools in order to build these experiences, of simplification of the underlying protocols in order to be able to ship that content out. I mean, we're able to do video on a scale that I know it just seems so sort of automatic that we're all on Zoom and Teams and GChat and whatever
all
else.
these different platforms, yeah.
But the underlying compression and the distribution and the capacity to send all of these bits while everyone is doing this, and yes, we have jitter, and yes, we have a few things that go out, but it is mind-boggling how much video is being sent out, more so than at any time before. And we're still watching Netflix and YouTube and all this other stuff. This is not like, oh, all of that stopped and then we have like, oh, this great channel of video. This is while
on the contrary, I think it's gone into hyperdrive.
And ISPs are still trying to block us. Like, so what's happening is this crazy game of data compression and high quality filters, and us having all kinds of weird backgrounds and noses and hats and stuff while we're on our video chats, and being able to record that and disseminate that and store it somewhere. It's crazy. So all of that, we needed groundwork to get there. Had this happened, let's say in 2000, this would not have been possible, right? I mean, there were some amazing tools even in 2000, but we've scaled to another level to be able to do this in the browser. Browser technology has improved so much. So I think we're at a cusp where we can take this to the next level, because the other main thing that's happening is building technology is changing, like spatial technology is changing. You know, so living in Dubai is very interesting in that, you know, this is the most ambitious place I have ever lived. I just can't imagine. So I've not lived in China. I don't know what's going on there, but I do know that China is also like crazy ambitious about a lot of things that they do. Mm-hmm. But here, in roughly 40 years, it's gone from literally like sand to the tallest building in the world, which I can see on one side,
to and the largest man-made island.
Largest man-made island, and the weirdest building in the world, which I get to see every day. And like I mean, there's an interesting concept in there, in that you go, okay, now we know how to make these, or we figured out how to make these structures. I mean, and the tools even to do that are recent, right? To do parametrically designed buildings is really complicated, and we needed the tools to get there. Mm-hmm. So now our next phase is to go, how do we activate those spaces? And this is where experience design becomes really, really important, because we have been thinking about the 3D world by designing it in a 2D space. And we now need to come up with the tools to build for the experiences that we're in, you know?
Yeah, basically be able to build a 3D experience in a 3D space, as opposed to conceptualizing and building these experiences within that 2D realm.
Yeah, and I mean, architects have had to like grapple with that for a very long time, of like, how do you come up with a crazy concept?
They're still grappling with it.
Yeah, they're still grappling with it. And my friend Catherine Devine, our friend Catherine Devine, also we chatted about this a couple of weeks ago, of like Microsoft Mesh is coming out with like, you know, trying to put people into a space where they can haul still at the, you know, baby steps of that wave. But our ambition for those experiences is significantly farther than the tools allow us to get to. You know, we've created wonderful 3D-esque experiences, even with the limitations of a 2D design space.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's interesting. I think, like, what are some of the advancements that you've seen to be able to kind of push that thought process ahead? What have been some of the things that you've seen that have kind of helped expedite these ideas and bring them into fruition?
That is a tough question. I mean, I've seen I think the simplification of some of the tools is the first step. You know, things like Touch Designer and the advancements that have happened in Unity. That said, like I do think that we're still grappling with this. I feel like there are a ton of ideas that are still fermenting in the COVID year that are suddenly going to start seeing life in the next months or next couple of years. You know, I haven't seen like the fantastic tools that we can actually build in 3D yet. You know, and there's some parts of this that are frustrating. You know, like some things that you feel should be simple, that we should just be able to do, are still incredibly complicated. The dumbest one is, of course, like, creating a website. Why is it so hard to create a website? I don't get it. Why? Like, why is it so hard to create a website today? Not only that, the stack is only getting more complicated. I have to say, so when I started at Local Projects, like, I wasn't really familiar with a lot. Like, I had come just from doing a bunch of social games in Flash.
Yeah.
And then we transitioned over, and like Flash was just going away, and but we were still using it. Like Flex and Flash were still really the only tools that we could use to like build certain things. And then things like open frameworks and Cinder and these kinds of like GL tools,
WebGL
for that. It was great. It was like that was just starting, and the web started improving, and then there was like, oh my God, this like HTML5 versus Flash thing, which we all hate. And
it's because you spent way too much time on investing your time into ActionScript, Sundar.
No, it's funny because like that same paradigm is what is coming back. You go, oh wow, it's a good thing I learned that, because basically I have the tools to comprehend how to build, because it's all the developers came from that world, right? They're just like, oh, I remember how to do this. I'm going to use the same paradigm to build the next set of tools. So we're sort of in a weird incestuous cycle there.
Yeah, but I would say it's the same thing inside of just video technology too as a whole. I keep on saying that we're playing the Inception game, where you can have all kinds of different technologies now running within each other.
As long as they're the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
and that's a super unfair characterization, because it's also really tough to have a paradigm change in how you program, right? There's certain things that we are constrained by what computational systems provide for us. But I'll step away from that for just a second and say that one of the great things has been that the designers have now been able to get to the point of activating systems easier. And by that, I will say that like some of my former colleagues had like, they pushed me in a way of thinking, how can we build without writing code? Like, so one of the early projects that I was involved with, or mid projects I was involved with, was how can we not write code and do all of the activations directly in After Effects? Can we actually make After Effects the final CMS pipeline? Can we actually do trigger points and things like that? And you go, wow, like that was radical at the time, and it was successful. And then you see that was the progenitor to people making things like Touch Designer, and you go, okay, like node-based systems actually work, and you just run the node-based system. And that's the thing that generates dynamic, experiences. But now designers can say, oh, I want the blinky light to go on, and I can design the blinky light going on in the tool that I am using, and like sit with somebody, and we do that whole thing. Execution really is in the same workbench. And I think that's the one of the pieces of magic that we've had, like the design to workflow, design to manifestation workflow all like together. The next step is to make hardware do that, right? Like can we do that where you have an idea, and I can print a circuit and have it do the thing and create the widget, or like the thing. I mean, it's even hard to articulate it because we don't have the language of how to make that happen, right? So
I think we're starting to see a lot more of that come into fruition today anyway, especially with 3D printing and technologies along those lines, where you can quickly prototype things that would take you a very long time to do. You can now digitally print circuit boards directly from your computer. So seeing that kind of technology evolve has definitely made the tool sets much more available to the mass public, for one, but it's also kind of created a more simplified workflow, for people to be able to evolve things and prototype things and push technology forward at a much more expedited rate than ever before. Laura had a really great question here about what do you think creative technologists from other design disciplines, such as live events, do not understand about museum storytelling?
Creative technologists from other design disciplines do not understand about museum storytelling. Oh, wow. How much trouble am I going to get into here? Well, speaking of digging our own graves.
You are welcome. Can't blame me for this one. This one's all on Laura.
I don't think that it's, so I'll start with being very fair, because I think it is hard to even go, what is museum storytelling, right? Because
all the trouble indeed.
Well, yes, all the trouble. I think it's hard because, a lot of museums are grappling with what is the story in the artifact? Like, just because you put a bunch of Egyptian reliefs into a space, that tell you the story of how Egypt was at the time, and then how do you act? What is that context? So I have, one of my favorite examples of this is a lot of museums, particularly in the US, but also in the UK, will take artifacts from temples in South Asia, and it's a point of irritation for me, to be honest. And there's no context. They'll put icons or idols next to each other that just don't have any sense.
Don't make any sense. There's no resemblance.
Exactly. If you go, okay, let me put a Hieronymus Bosch next to Matisse and go, okay, there's this thing, right? And you go, okay, it's just because they both did weird stuff. When you walk into a space, you just don't know why it is that narrative is there. And a curator, obviously, a much more educated person, was like, oh, I should not be dumb about it. Let me actually bring out the nuance of what they were doing together in a really interesting way. I think that's the hard part about storytelling, because we need to know so much in order to tell the story in a way that is interesting. But a lot of people actually just want to even understand the context of what that story is. I was actually, we were trash talking this whole Van Gogh immersive experience thing that's happening with somebody. I'll be totally fair, blunt about that. But then you go, well, why is that not okay? And it's amazing. Starry Night around you is actually kind of fun. To feel the paint
immersed
around you. It's amazing. It's truly amazing. All the stuff that But we also, as slightly more academic people, go, oh my God, that is just so gauche. That is not okay. We've made a very commercialized,
taboo.
Totally taboo. But maybe that's the thing. Maybe we need to break those boundaries a lot more. Be a little bit more irreverent in how we conceptualize this, and maybe that gives us the mechanisms for telling stories in a more interesting way. I think to Laura's question about the creative technologists and how they think about these stories, sometimes I would say this is true for me as well. It took me a long time to understand that the final experience is really is the most important thing, and everything else has to go away. And as a programmer, it's really hard, because you're like, okay, I need to start by programming, and then I'll get there. To start at the end result and then go back to what you need to program, just very uncomfortable, because you have to do this whole process, And I think that's the hardest part. And with tools where the designer can sit with the developer or with the technologist, it makes it better, because both parts of the story can be told, together.
So touching on that, which is again an interesting thought that just came to mind, is what is your feel then from working in a museum and being able to portray a story and working on an exhibit where a lot of it's curated, and you've got a bunch of different input from, say, purists that want to make sure that the story is told in the proper manner, not to impede on or to affect, how the piece is being viewed, to the creative side and the creative aspect, where you want to be able to enhance the experience of the exhibit, or you want to enhance the story through using creative ideas. And I guess my question is like, where is the line between having the story already being basically set and being told in a certain way, to being able to add and splash the creative aspect to it, to make it more engaging or to make it more appealing for people to experience or to view?
I'm going to throw this question at you.
Damn it.
What does creative mean to you? I guess because we love to use that prefix, right? How would you define what creative is?
That's a great question.
I feel like that's what you're asking, right? Like, in a way, like it's. I mean, I think
Well,
about
I guess for an
how
example,
engineering was. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, for an example, we see a lot of virtual experiences that are being created right now, where you're taking kind of a conventional approach, but you're imposing them into a completely virtualized world where physics doesn't even matter anymore, and the whole idea of reality just kind of goes out the window. But you can still watch and be part of that experience and still be connected in the same way that you used to be. Like, you're still watching an artist, for example, singing on a stage, but they're in a whole different environment at that moment,
right.
Whereas before we had virtual production, that didn't exist. It was putting them into a physical location with physical things around them. And you as a person still had the experience, and you still had that impact of watching the artist, and being there for the artist, but it's a whole different experience, So you're kind of taking the creative chains off of physics, and you're taking the creative chains off of real world dynamics, and completely, being able to completely work in an environment that doesn't exist anymore. Right. So that's a kind of creative spin to taking a live event and virtualizing it, where we start to see a lot of that same thing happening in museums, where technology is coming into play. We're starting to see, video overlays and films coming up in front of an artifact where you can interact with it and be able to come up, get more information about the artifact that you're viewing, for example, and the history of the artifact. And we're seeing a lot more of these interactive displays and designs happening, but some of those might be more happy accidents, where you've got a creative technologist that's working along with a curator for the museum that is curating the exhibit and might not have the experience of a creative technologist. So I guess to reframe my question, it's like, where is the line between having something that's already pre-curated in the curator's mind, and then having a creative technologist come along and say, hey, there's this technology over here that could really help enhance this exhibit, or could change the way that somebody experiences this exhibit. So where is the line there?
I think I would put that more in the realm of alchemy. And by that, I mean that, again, going back to like the Renaissance era or even a little bit beyond that, if you think about people like Newton and Michelangelo, and that whole era of people who are considered alchemists of their era first, but they were engineers who really understood different aspects of both how people interacted with stuff and how nature actually created stuff, right? Like, they may not have understood every aspect of it, but they knew like certain things that other people maybe didn't. And by that, I mean, like, so a lot of what we do is just cook, right? Like, engineers actually we take ingredients from places and then make sure, like, I think the difference between an engineer and a technologist is that an engineer has to like make sure that the thing actually works for an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a very unfair and maybe overly nuanced sort of separation. And a technologist goes, okay, like I actually can put these things together. And I don't mean to minimize that by any stretch at all. But the creative part of it is in knowing what those ingredients are capable of doing. Maybe a metaphor would help, or an analogy, which is, you can always get a bunch of spices and throw them together. But there's certain spices that work together in a particular way, and less is more in many, many cases. Getting just the right amount of garlic and olive oil onto something is all you need. And you can try throwing the oregano and the basil and whatever else you want, and it is not going to make it any better. It's not going to
taste any better.
It's not going to taste any better. But you also need to know how to source the right thing. You have to know that the tomatoes that you get are exactly like right. You can't just be like, okay, I'm going to open up any can of tomatoes, throw it in, pour a bunch of olive oil and garlic, and it works. It doesn't. Like it is not just layering. It is actually crafting. And I think that's where some of this happens. I think like you asked about how does a curator get helped in this process? Even if you take the simplest thing of like, from a curator's perspective, you need to label an element that's on a wall. And somebody comes in and goes, actually, you know what? Like there's going to be low lighting in this room. We don't need to actually put a spotlight on it or put a digital screen on it or anything like this. There is a mechanism to use fluorescent ink or electroluminescent ink, put it in a particular way that when the door opens, it absorbs sufficient light that when you walk in, it's activated, and then it fades out, and then it's gone, and then you have the piece. So like things like that. I think that is where the creative aspect of it comes in, is to know and I think it's also important to keep in mind that it's not a discipline, so I am very much of the mindset that they had, just because you're a historian having studied whatever does not preclude you from being a creative technologist. Just because you got an engineering degree doesn't make you a creative technologist. In fact, I know far too many engineers who are incapable of being creative because they're unable to think from the perspective of the end user's experience. So curator might be too academic and not think from the perspective of what is the story, and the technologist might actually come in and go, no, actually you need to think about fonts in a different way. It's not about design. It's just like, how does that person absorb the information? I know that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but like, I wonder.
Well, I think it's actually a really good and impactful way, because it actually plays through to the same way that a lot of things are curated and done. It really, when you really boil everything down, whether you're working in live events or you're working inside of a museum or fixed installation market or theme park industry, you're really boiling down the same thing. It's all about the story, the messaging, and it's all about the experience. And
I think that there's so many aspects of that for each of us, because I think one of the other challenges that we grapple with is how not to make it feel isolationist. By that I mean, even like galleries also grapple with this a fair amount. Like I went to a showing. It was Robert Mapplethorpe at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago, and Mapplethorpe's very provocative in many ways, but there's also is fun when you're around other people experiencing the provocation. There are aspects of how other people react to a piece that actually gives you like the context for having a conversation in public. And I think that's the kind of joy in some of the stuff that we create. Like the creative in immersion is not in the immersion for me. It is the immersion of me with the other people around me, and so that we have like a joint experience, you know. And I think this is like when you think about what the most common immersive experience that we have is dance. You know, you go to a club, you're with other people, and somebody elicits an emotion in you, and that is it, right? Like, and this is why you have a VJ plus a DJ in these places, because they're just like, we want to take you somewhere else. That's what we all try to do in like our own little segmented ways.
It's so true. It's even that way when we're introducing ourselves as people and communicating as people. You know, we all emanate different emotions and different feelings, and we emanate those to the people around us, and then those people interpret it in their own way, and then they gauge our own personality off of their own feelings. You know, and it's such a powerful thing that I think we all tap into for everything that we do, you know, from every experience that we come across, which is the best part about being human.
Very much. It is true. It is you know, I think humanity is capable of incredible darkness and incredible light, you know, but I think the way that we tell our stories can feel bright even if it comes from a very dark place. And I think that's our opportunity to kind of go, okay, like what are these different mechanisms that we have to bring these out? Because I mean, you think about some of the stuff from the Renaissance era, those are some seriously dark stories. Like, you know, you think about those paintings, you're just like, wow, people had messed up lives, man. But then you go, wow, how did they think of the chemistry of those particular things coming together? And it's like, you know, creating these kinds of rich colors that became even brighter over time, you know? Mm-hmm. And you have to go like, wow, this is such a like amazing way that humanity could even conceive that their story wasn't for their lifetime. Their story was for significantly farther out, you know? And so, I mean, to the previous question about like, you know, what does the future look like? It's really what we want to craft out of it, right? We can go, it can be significantly impactful to the next generation, and they're the ones who kind of unpack it and make it more interesting. Or we can do it just for the next, you know, moment in front of us, for the person who's going to see it right, you know, like immediately after.
Right, so, then and there.
Yeah.
Well, Sundar, I think we're coming to our time. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today on this session of Ahead of the Curve. For those of you who are watching and want to get some more information on Sundar or want to reach out to him, his email address is cybertoast@gmail.com. And he also has another project that he's been working on called Creative Stack. That's on substack.com. Really great articles there. Actually, Laura turned me on to your second episode. So I actually read my way through a lot of that this morning in between, and some great work that you've got in there, Sundar. So I would heavily advise any of you who are watching to please check that out.
Thank you, Geoffrey. This was super fun. And, also, it's a collaborative project with a lot of other people. So yeah, if anyone's interested, please go there, reach out.
Absolutely. And for those of you viewing that don't know, we have changed our format. We are doing these more on a monthly basis right now. We're targeting the third week or third Thursday of every month to be able to bring you guys content like we have over the last year. So please make sure to keep your eyes on our social media channels as we look into promoting next month's episode. Also, of course, we are working now in conjunction with Framework. So we'll also be informing you of everything that is happening through the Framework community. And as I say, everyone, thank you so much, and stay ahead of the curve, everyone. Thank you so much, Sundar, for being on with me today.
Thank you.